Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the roaring 20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
Desde 2019, a Toyota vem acelerando o futuro, produzindo no Brasil o primeiro híbrido flex do mundo. De lá pra cá, as coisas mudaram. Muitos entraram na tendência que a gente criou. Mas sabe o que não mudou? A confiança do brasileiro na Toyota, que não veio da noite pro dia. Toyota, no futuro há muito tempo. Paz no trânsito começa por você.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today we're talking pirates. Now, we've talked about various pirates on this podcast before. It has pirates and also bushrangers, who are kind of like land pirates in Australia, have always been of great interest to me. I think especially in this post Our Flag Means Death era, a lot of people are sort of reevaluating pirates and all the interesting. They weren't just like cis white dudes is the thing. Then more and more people are coming to realize there were lady pirates, there were queer pirates, there were trans pirates, there were pirates of various different cultural backgrounds, pirates of color. And so I came across Instagram reel. Actually, I came across it because I was following Avery Cunningham, who we had on the podcast before talking about her book a while ago. And Avery Cunningham had reposted this one by Ella McLeod, who has just come out with a book called The Map That Led to You. And so I was like, oh man, so Ella's post was about her reel on Instagram, which I'll share also when this episode comes out, was talking about all the research that she's done on pirates and kind of just her understanding and how she's coming to realize there's sorts of gray areas of history, like whose stories get told and whose stories don't, and what does that mean about who is left out of the historical record. And it's all the sort of stuff that I really vibe with, that I like to dive into on this podcast. So I was like, man, that was a great Instagram reel. I'm going to share it. And then I did. And so then through that, Ella and I connected to the point that now she's on the podcast to basically what I told her. I forget if it's in what we recorded or just chatting before. It was just like what she's saying in that reel. Like, let's just turn that into an episode because it's also interesting. She talks about this in the episode, but just in the process of preparing for her book, The Map That Led to You, she did so much researching about like nautical history and pirate history, but also about sort of legends about mermaids, a lot of Caribbean folklore. There's so much information, and I just wanted to bring her on to talk about all that stuff. So please enjoy this chat with Ella McLeod. So Ella McLeod, welcome to the Vulgar History Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you, number one, because I read your book and I love it. And number two,
oh my God,
because
you
have so much information about pirates and pirates people don't talk about. And we've done a couple episodes about that, but I never get tired of learning about it. So number one, most importantly, first tell everybody about your book.
So my book is called The Map That Led to You. It came out last week, Thursday. And it is a romance, fantasy, young adult novel about pirates and mermaids and falling in love and home, and also just trying to understand what history is, like how the stories that get told are influenced by the people that are telling them, influence the future, but also why certain stories get told and why others don't, I guess. Over the kind of course of writing it and researching it, I went down many rabbit holes, but also just did a lot of general thinking about what exists in the margins of stories, and what exists in the margins of history, and what assumptions we can make about those gaps. So yeah, the story centers a boy called Levi, whose dad is a fictional pirate captain, and he lives aboard his dad's ship which is called the Sea Dragon, with his sister, his adopted sister Vega, and they are, the children of pirates. So that was a really fun world for me to get to kind of temporarily inhabit. I spent a lot of time at the Royal Maritime Museum in London, in Greenwich, which luckily is really near where I live. It was just like such a fun place to be researching and reading. And so, they live aboard a pirate ship and a baby buccaneers, really kind of keen to follow in their dad's footsteps of piracy. And then through various events that I'm not going to spoil, they end up on a pirate republic. And I was very much inspired by the pirate republic. I'm doing that in quotation marks. It was never an official republic, by the pirate republic in Nassau, on the island of New Providence, that existed during the golden age of piracy. It's such a cool idea, this idea of a place where pirates sought to live outside of empire. And in doing reading about that, I feel like I had a lot of questions about what being a pirate even meant and was. So that was really at the heart of why I wanted to write what I write. And then there's also a mermaid, because mermaid mythology, you can't really have pirate mythology without having a mermaid somewhere. So that was important to me. So the mermaid in my story is called the River Mama, and she's based on a mermaid in Jamaican mythology. And even that story is kind of quite closely tied to empire and colonization and the colonization of the Caribbean. So it all sort of felt quite organic, the forming of this world that is fictitious but based in reality. And then there's a kind of other story of, in the modern day, a girl called Reggie is living on what was once the Pirate Republic, and is learning about its history and coming to terms with, what history is, what it means to try and unpick the past, and how that impacts her as somebody that is descended from these people and lives in the future of this world. So it's swashbuckling and it's romantic and it's fun, but it took me down some really interesting lines of historical inquiry, I guess.
So what sorts of information is there at this museum you're going to? Because like part of what we were saying is that like there's not that much information about who were the pirates and what were they doing. So like what records actually exist?
Yeah. So, oh my God, if anyone is listening and is a Londoner and hasn't been to the Maritime Museum at Greenwich, it's like one of my favorite places. It's so great. So first of all, it's like right on the river, right next to the Cutty Sark, which is a ship. So you can walk around this old, like, I think it's a man of war. I might be wrong. It might be a brigantine, but it's like an enormous naval ship, and it's kind of been it's moored inland, and it's been hollowed out, and the bottom part of it has been turned into a museum. So you get all of the particulars about how many people you would need to man different crews on kind of different kinds of pirate ships, all of the different kinds of ships. So from your smaller sloops to your much bigger man of wars, how many cannons, how many guns. So all of that stuff was what I loved, because I feel like it really gave the world that I was creating, which is a world of fantasy. So there is magic, but I feel like having all of that kind of information really rooted the world in something that felt textured and real. So, having Levi and Vega being able to reel off like how many guns they would need and how many people they would need as crew and things. So that's a big part of what you learn if you go to the Maritime Museum. There's a lot of art. There are a lot of historical artifacts, from old navigation tools to old uniforms, old naval medals. You have old captain's logs. It's so cool. I learned a huge amount from just the volunteers that work there. Like the volunteers they have that work there for free are the loveliest people, but also just like an amazing resource. Like they all know so much because they're all really passionate about the subject. So in particular, I found during the crossover between piracy and the transatlantic slave trade, the relationship between pirates and slavers, it just fascinated me. I think the thing that I really took away from the time that I spent there was that while our understanding of what a pirate is partially rooted in fact, this idea of a lawless group of mercenaries who would, butcher and assault and steal, there was also a a kind of democracy amongst pirates. They did actually have a pirate code. They did actually uphold values of kind of like egalitarianism. So everything in a crew was voted on democratically. That's not to say that there weren't tyrannical pirate captains. Obviously, there would have been, but it was quite standard for things to be made as a collective. All plunder was divided equally. And I found this idea that we've been sold this idea of pirates being one thing, but actually it being thornier and more nuanced than that, really compelling. There were also accounts that I found in my research of pirates running interference during the slave trade. Now, it's hard to say for sure whether that was because it was more profitable for pirates to disrupt the slave trade than it was for them to enable it sometimes. But I don't think it's surprising or I don't think it's untenable to imagine, if what we know about pirates is that a lot of them were heavily opposed to empire, to also assume that some of them are running interference on these slave ships in order to disrupt the slave trade. And there is evidence of them doing that. So I found that really, really fascinating as well. And then just the sort of the rise of pirates becoming privateers. So as anti-piracy laws became more strongly enacted and became more kind of and policies around piracy got pushed further through Parliament, and the British Empire in particular worked to really expel piracy from its colonies in the Caribbean. A lot of pirates sold out their fellow pirates and became privateers for navies. And the Republic of Pirates, so the base of this kind of loose confederacy, I suppose you could call it, in the Bahamas, was a place where that happened, basically. So there was a group of men who would flip flop between being pirates and privateers. So out for themselves, out for a navy, selling their labor and ships to the highest bidder, who did form a kind of a brief democracy for, I think it was something like 15 years. No, it was 1706 to 1718. So what's that? 12 years. So, and predominant among them were the Flying Gang, who, if you are familiar with pirate stories, are probably the names that you're most familiar with. So Mary Bonny and Teach and Calico Jack and all of these kind of famous pirate names. So it's a really interesting period of history, and the Maritime Museum is rife with stories. And then next to the Maritime Museum, you have the Royal Observatory, which is all about the relationship between the sea and the stars, which is a theme that features really heavily in my book, and also just something I find really interesting. The way that people had to use the stars as a tool of navigation. And I had a really interesting conversation while I was researching with a professor at Oxford University about the standardization of cartography, and how actually like maps weren't standardized in the way that they are now. And they were a hugely profitable industry. So it was quite hard to regulate. And so often it would be more reliable to use the stars because they didn't change, basically. So yeah, God, I've rambled on there, haven't I?
No, that's fine. That's fine. That's why I love to have you here, because I saw you did this reel on Instagram talking about pirates and pirate history, and I was just like, I'd love to have her on the podcast and just like expand on that whole like
Yeah.
2-minute thing. But like just
Yeah.
going back to, so like in terms of slavery, but also in terms of who became pirates, in terms of like people who maybe escaped slavery, or women and other marginalized people, like what have you come across about that? Or are those sort of the corners where you're sort of thinking about, why isn't this recorded?
Yeah. So, I mean, we do know that, I say no. No is tricky. I guess we can, it's been estimated that at least a third of pirates during the Golden Age were former enslaved people. And again, like it would really depend captain to captain how these people were treated. Of course, there still would have existed horribly racist pro-slavery pirate captains. But there are examples of equality amongst pirate crews, and that equality existed regardless of race. One example is Black Caesar, who served aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. So he was under Blackbeard, and he was a very well-respected, revered, terrifying pirate who was ostensibly, from what I have seen, afforded the same level of respect as any other pirate aboard in his crew. So yeah, there was a huge formerly enslaved population amongst pirates because of the relationship, because of the naval relationship and the kind of maritime relationship between slave ships and pirates. There are accounts of pirates, coming about on cargo ships. Those cargo ships would not just have contained tea and sugar and rice, they would have contained human cargo. So people, enslaved people. And often, while there were some, and then it would have been, I guess it would have been up to the captain's discretion whether or not he sold those people back into slavery, or whether it would have been more profitable or more in keeping with their own sense of equality, say, to liberate those people and have them join their crews, etc. So it was so dependent on the captain, but I think that it's significant that it was dependent upon the captain, because it suggests that while I think it's easy to paint the 18th century very much in a kind of binary of like people that were pro-slavery and abolitionists, actually it was murkier than that. It was far more nuanced than that. And there were far more kind of there's a far wider variety of ideology at play. And a lot of that did just come down to capital. Like, would it have benefited you more to have, to gain crew members, So, and equally, if you were an enslaved person who had somehow liberated themselves, you had a better chance of being treated equally fairly and surviving as a member of a pirate crew than you did if you, I don't know, tried to in some way find a place for yourself in a incredibly racist and violent society.
And now for a quick advertising break.
Salve, meu povo! Aqui é o Igão. Ó, ouvindo um podcast no caminho do trabalho ou enquanto prepara a comida? Acertei? Mas uma coisa que eu sei é que cê tá aí no corre. Hoje em dia, todo mundo é correria. Parece até que o dia tem mais de 24 horas. É por isso que Rexona te dá muito mais proteção para você encarar a sua rotina. Rexona, proteção superior a 72 horas por dia. Rexona não te abandona.
Desfrute do novo Icon of the Seas da Royal Caribbean, agora partindo de Miami. É o ícone das férias repleto de atrações, com o maior parque aquático no mar e espetáculos sensacionais da Broadway. Com destinos incríveis no Caribe, incluindo a premiada ilha particular Perfect Day at Coco Cay, a aventura nunca acaba. Icon of the Seas, as melhores férias em família do mundo. Acesse royalcaribbean.com/BRA. Aplicam-se termos e condições.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. Yeah, I love just the thinking about this whole world where there's the pirate republic and, within crews, people, there's this sort of equality, these kind of pirate unions. And it's just, yeah, it's such a gray area of history in general, like you just said.
And even just in terms of like practically thinking about like literacy, like, we have to remember that a lot of the information we have and a lot of the stories that make up history are told by people that would have had access to not only the materials through which to like record those stories, but even just like the knowledge, like literacy levels were incredibly low amongst formerly enslaved turned pirates, So I always like to bear that in mind when I'm thinking about these things.
No, exactly. In the sort of history that I look at for this podcast, often it's rare and exciting for me when I find a record from somebody who is like an enslaved person or like a lower class working person. Like it's so rare to get those examples of people, but that was such a huge proportion of who was out in the world. And we only know about like, well, Henry VIII was doing this or whatever, where it's like, yeah, but who are the other millions of people? And were they interesting? I don't know.
Exactly. It's so true. It's so true.
And what about female pirates?
Yeah, so again, loads of gaps, very thorny. We know of Anne Bonny, we know of Mary Read. We have evidence of a few women of color pirates. Sayyida al-Harar is like my personal favorite to read about. She was a Barbary pirate. So she was from Morocco, and she was like incredibly powerful, incredibly well, I was going to say well respected, feared. I mean, feared. And she would have been sailing in sometime in the kind of early to mid 16th century. But we have like very little evidence of women pirates. And I don't think that that's because they didn't exist. I just think obviously there was a huge amount of prejudice and superstition around women at sea at the time. Women aboard ships were considered unlucky. I think that that's because of the patriarchy, but also in the mythology of so many cultures, the sea itself is considered like a very like divinely feminine force. A lot of the mythological creatures that exist at sea are feminized and were feminized by men in the navies and male pirates. So sirens and mermaids and other creatures that were considered to want to, sing men to their deaths at sea. And so there was this real kind of pervasive sense that women at sea would only bring about the doom of the men on board. I don't think that that means that Anne Bonny and Mary Read and Saida and the few others that we know about were the only women pirates. I just think it means that the others didn't get caught. you know, Women aboard ships particularly in the golden age of piracy would have often dressed in male attire or typically male attire. So I think it's fair to assume that there was a wider variety of female pirates than we know about. But yeah, like Sayyida Al-Harar is a great one. Jacquot de la Haye is another one that's really fascinating. She was Haitian. She's another example of a woman that we think was a woman of color because she was of Haitian descent. And as many did, dressed as a man, took on male aliases, faked her death a couple of times. And yeah, she was sailing in the kind of mid 17th century, so kind of 1650s. So they existed. I think that I personally think, and it's edgy. It would be not a leap to say that there are more of them than we know of.
Well, and then also that gets into like in a time period where it's like men dress like this and women dress like this. So for a woman to wear trousers, like that's just like, she's disguising herself as a man, where it gets into like, well, maybe gender stuff, maybe like trans stuff, like, and who knows? Because people didn't have that language then.
They didn't have the language, absolutely. Yeah, so I so agree with that. And the world of piracy, because the writing around it and the literature around it is so heavily influenced and so dominated by the people that were persecuting them. So like naval logs and records from arms of empire. I think a huge there are just so few first-hand accounts, and even less of those written by women or women of color. So yeah, there's just this big like dearth of knowledge, and I find it a really interesting space to kind of play in with fiction, but also I guess sort of trying to fill the gaps of history with stuff that we do know to be true.
Well, and that's what I find. I mean, your book obviously takes place, there's like fantasy elements and stuff in it too. But I think that's the best place for us to play around is fiction in exploring what really happened, where it's like, well, people can't write a academic book being like, well, here's the facts, but it's like, well, let's just imagine. And I think that's the best way. I know there's a book coming out, or maybe it has come out, about Jacquot de la Haye that I plan to read as well. Yeah.
Yes, there is. I think it's not out in the UK yet, I don't think. But I've heard from friends who read it, I've heard very good things. And I just know it's going to be right on my alley. So
yeah, exactly. I love this. I don't know. Do you have thoughts about, what is it? Our Flag Means Death, the TV show. Did you watch any of that?
Oh, so good. I love it. I love it so much.
I feel like that is kind of what's a bit ushered in a new pirate
Yeah, for sure.
enthusiasm. But
It
also when I was
has.
watching it, I was thinking like, it's silly and it's fun and everything, but I was like, this is kind of correct. Like this is the variety of just like the ethnicities of the people on the ship and why they're there and like queer people. I'm just like, this is kind of accurate, actually.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm watching Black Sails at the moment. I don't know if you've watched Black Sails. It's like
I've
quite
heard of it.
old now. Yeah, it's quite old. And I didn't watch it while I was writing because I was like, oh, I feel like it sounds so perfect that I'm worried I'm gonna like low-key rip off the
Yeah,
vibes.
yeah.
So I decided to wait till after and like reward myself with it. And it's so good. And I feel the same way. I think that the exploration of like queerness and blackness in this world feels um it feels truer to life because it reflects the world as I see it and as I know it, which is that people aren't just straight and white. And it is really interesting to me when we have conversations about historical storytelling where people say, well, that's simply not accurate. And it's like, babe, did you think that gay people didn't exist before the 70s? Like, is that really like is that what we're gonna do here? Because of course queerness has existed like forever.
There's things like just because you're in England, I know that there's been some criticism about some historical dramas when they put black people in, and it's like, well, there were black people where they're like, oh, it's just like you're changing the history. It's like, no, it's just that the old TV shows were made in the 60s and they didn't have
Yeah,
black actors allowed to have
yeah.
lead roles then. It's like the black people didn't the same thing. It's like they didn't just appear in England in like 1985. Like
No,
it's
totally.
yeah, so it's actually correcting.
For sure. And I think that like what is interesting with piracy in particular is like so much of it takes place in the Caribbean. And I'm just like, wow, it's wild how I've been watching this film or this TV show that's set in the Caribbean and we're like 5 episodes in and I've not seen a single brown person because that is not accurate, believe
Mhm.
me. So I think that that's the other thing that's just like important about trying to re-understand history as a an indicator of things that have been and a version of things that have been, but in no way the full story. And really remembering like why
Well,
certain
and I think
stories
that's
get
also it's
told.
important to interrogate, like you were saying. So many of the records come from the naval officers. It's like, well, who wrote
Yeah,
down this history and what were their
exactly.
goals and how did they want to present it? And we don't take that at face value
Yeah,
because they obviously had an
completely.
agenda. Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's not just like, well, that was true because he wrote it. It's like, yeah, but he was, he had reasons for writing it that way. Yeah.
yeah, totally, totally.
Can you just tell everybody about your book? It's now out. I was able to get it. So I believe it's
Oh,
out in North
great.
America as well as in the UK.
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, you can order it online, can't you? You know what it's like. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's out. Yeah, online and everywhere that you would normally get a book. Yeah, it's called The Map That Led to You. Pirates, mermaids. Mermaids were another thing I really felt very passionately about looking at. Particularly, I sort of started conceptualizing this story in the aftermath of Halle Bailey being like announced as Ariel, or in the sort of the moment where like everybody was really cross that there was a black mermaid was when I had started writing, and I was like, oh, hilarious that people think that mermaids only exist in Caucasian mythology. Like really, really funny that
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, exactly.
like
Because, yeah, like in terms of like the Caribbean and like places that are on the
yeah.
ocean, like of course they have mythology as well.
Of
Yeah.
course, like I mean, the river mama, who's the sort of the mermaid in my story, comes from Caribbean folklore, and I think she's a sort of composite of like West African mammy water stories, um, and European mermaid stories because of the way that colonization in the Caribbean worked. And she very specifically um, guards in the stories my grandmother told me when I was growing up. She guards like the treasure that the Spanish left behind when they left the Caribbean after I think it was a battle with the English. So like that's her origin story, like so closely tied to the land and the colonization of the land and like the like trying to defend something about a place while knowing that that so much of what makes up that place is intrinsically linked with violence. I find that compelling, and I find that really central to like the heart of how we understand mermaid stories and how mermaid stories kind of inform us about, misogyny at sea, and just like both the fetishization and the fear of powerful, dangerous women. But mermaids exist in basically every culture. They're one of the few, I think it's mermaids and dragons that have that in common, where like you can go to sort of any, it's weird, like there are cultures that would never have met that have really similar stories about mermaids and dragons. And I don't know, maybe that means they existed at one point. Or
I
maybe
hope
it
so.
just speaks to a shared anxiety. But yeah, I hope so too.
No, exactly. So your book is available all over the place. I saw like you've launched it already, but I saw some pictures. People are coming dressed up as pirates to your events and stuff. It looks like such
It
a
was
good
really
time.
cool. It was a really good time. Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So people can pick up this book wherever. And how can they keep up with you on? You have a podcast. Tell everyone about your podcast.
Yes, I do. I have a podcast on the Maximum Fun Network called Comfort Creatures. It's me and the wonderful Alexis B. Preston. And we just have cool people on to talk about animals and pets. We're both big animal lovers, also big fans of mythological creatures. So we say that all animals welcome, both the real and the fictitious. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, feel free to join us there. And then I am available everywhere at McLeodmouth. So MCLEOD_mouth. And that's on Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and all the usual places.
Which is very clever, I have to say, McLeod Mouth.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
I love it so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Like, again, I saw you talking about the pirate and the pirate history, and I was just like, oh man, this is so great. And then your publicist was like, do you want to have Ella on your show? I'm like, yes.
I'm so glad. I mean, any excuse just to talk about just like history, and then also like the stuff we don't know. That's the thing that I'm so compelled by, is what don't we know? Why don't we know it? Whose agenda does it serve for us not to know it? All of that good stuff.
That's fabulous. Well, thank you so much, and best of luck with your book and connecting with readers and all that exciting stuff.
Thank you so much.
So again, you can pick up Ella's book, The Map That Led to You, basically anywhere. It's such an interesting combination of everything she just talked about, like the pirate history, but also like folklore and also the Caribbean and African folklore. There's also poetry in it. There's queer stuff in the book as well. So I really think it's really up everyone's alley who's a fan of this podcast. And as well as her podcast, Comfort Creatures. I mean, I'm recording this. Hepburn is literally 2 inches below this microphone. You can probably hear her purring right now. Like, what a great podcast. Everyone should listen to that as well. And maybe I'll be on it one day. What a dream. Anyway, Vulgar History, this podcast you're listening to. A couple of things I like to tell people about that if you want to connect with this podcast in different ways. So I do have a Substack now, which is like a newsletter where every week you get a free newsletter from me, which is an essay. At the moment, I'm going through the women of Tudor history. So I've gone through the wives of Henry VIII, Margaret Beaufort. Elizabeth Woodville is this week's, and I think next we're going to pivot over to Henry VIII's amazing sisters, Mary and Margaret, who you know from the podcast, but this will be like a newsletter version of that. Later on, we're going to get to the Grey sisters, just like there's a lot going on. So it's not duplicating the content of this podcast. It's like a complement to it. It's like a happy little treat in your inbox. And again, that's free. So you can find that at vulgarhistory.substack.com. You can also get more content from me. I have a Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. So for $1 or more a month, if you like join the Patreon to pledge, then you get early ad-free access to all the episodes of this podcast. So usually you get them like 3 to 4 days early, but also you can listen to the older episodes also without the ad breaks in them. And you also get access to bonus episodes of the various Patreon-only things that I do, which kind of vary in what they are. One of the mainstays, though, is Vulgar Piece Theater, which is a movie discussion podcast I do with friends of the podcast, Alison Epstein and Lana Witt Johnson, where we talk about costume dramas. And we just basically every episode of Vulgar Piece Theater is like 2 to 3 hours long, because when we get to talking, we have a lot to talk about. We talk about the real history that the movies are based on, but we also talk about the costumes of the movie and just have a good time. The most recent one was one of Lana's picks, The Road to Wellville, which is a movie about various things involving the history of cornflakes and health asylums in America. It's an odd movie, and we had a very interesting discussion about it. The next episode of this we're going to be talking about the first 2 episodes of the 1970s BBC miniseries I, Claudius, aka I, Clavdivs. Anyway, if you want to listen to that, that's on patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. If you join at $5 or more a month, you get access to all the old episodes of Vulgar Peace Theater, as well as these new ones that are coming out. Episodes about So This Asshole, where I talk about awful men from history, and also the after show, which is sometimes when things go long with a guest who I have on the show, we take it to the after show. If you want to listen to just specific episodes of the Patreon-only stuff, you can also just purchase those as a one-off thing without having to join for the membership. Or you can also, honestly, hack the system. Like, join up for a free 1-month membership, listen to everything you want to listen to, and then decide if you want to stay on or not. That's all happening at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. I also want to mention our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. So this is a beautiful jewelry making company. It's a small women-owned business. Literally, it is owned and run by 2 women based out of New York City. And what they do is they make beautiful jewelry inspired by women from mythology, connection to today's episode, talking about women from mythology, as well as women from mostly classical history. So the designs include people we've talked about on the podcast before, like Boudica, Cleopatra, Agrippina. Anne Boleyn is there. Like, it's mostly people from classical history and mythology, but you can't not include Anne Boleyn, especially when you have this collection like Tori has right now called the Difficult Women Collection. And, there's also a necklace of Hatshepsut, who we've talked about. Medusa, Aphrodite, Sappho is there. And so the pieces from Common Era Jewelry are available in solid gold, as well as in more affordable gold vermeil, and Vulgar History listeners can always get 15% off all items anytime that you buy them from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code VULGAR at checkout. And if you are interested in Vulgar History merchandise, that is available at vulgarhistory.com/store. Or if you're outside the US, shipping is a bit better if you go to our alternate site, vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. You can get in touch with me. There's a form if you go to vulgarhistory.com, or you can email me directly at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. And I'm also on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod. Transcripts of recent episodes are available at vulgarhistory.com. Thank you to Aveline Malik for providing these transcripts. Next week, we're going to be revisiting an era that we talked about last, I think 2 years ago, which is Choson Dynasty, like oldie times Korea. And I'm really excited about who I get to talk about that with you next week. News is coming out soon about the upcoming new season of Vulgar History, Season 7. I think next week I'll be announcing the topic and the theme, and we're going to be getting into that all in mid-May, so stay tuned for all that information. And until next time, my friends, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Ann Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Speight.
We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone. So we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.